So, how can two local shootings actually lead to the entire U.S. government shutting down? Yeah, it sounds pretty far-fetched, but believe it or not, that's a very real possibility facing Washington, D.C. this week. Today, we're going to break down this high-stakes countdown and explain exactly how a local crisis is spiraling into a national one. I mean, it sounds almost unbelievable, right? But this is the question that lawmakers in Washington are scrambling to answer as we speak. A local crisis has turned into a national flashpoint, and the clock is seriously ticking. Let's dig into how we got right to the edge of this thing. And this whole thing unfolded incredibly fast. On January 7th, you have the first fatal shooting with federal agents in Minneapolis. Then, just a little over 2 weeks later, boom, January 24th, it happens again. And now all eyes are on this one date, January 30th. That's the big deadline for Congress to pass a new spending bill and, keep the government's lights on.
Okay, so let's get into it. First up, let's talk about the immediate threat. What exactly is a government shutdown, and why is it even on the table right now?
Well, right now, the government isn't running on a proper full-year budget. Nope. Instead, it's operating on something called a continuing resolution, a CR for short. Think of it like a temporary spending patch, just to keep things from shutting down. The problem is, that patch runs out on January 30th.
And here's the really crucial part. If lawmakers can't agree on a new budget or even just another temporary patch by the end of this week, a funding gap opens up. That's the official term for when federal agencies literally run out of money and are legally forced to close their doors. So, the big question is, how did an incident in one city light the fuse on a massive national budget fight? Let's trace this whole thing from Minneapolis all the way to the U.S. Capitol.
And this really gets to the heart of the problem. You've got two completely different stories. On one side, you have the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, saying its agents acted in justified self-defense. But on the other side, there's video from the scene that seems to tell a totally different story. And that's what sparked this huge public outrage. So this conflict has basically turned the normal annual budget process into massive political battle. Because of all the controversy, Senate Democrats have basically drawn a line in the sand. They're saying, nope, we are not voting to approve funding for DHS unless there are new rules for oversight and accountability. And this right here is the key hurdle in Washington. In the Senate, you need 60 votes to get past a filibuster and move forward on big bills. But with the way the Senate is split right now, neither party can pass a funding bill by themselves. They have to work together. And at the moment, they're miles and miles apart. So everyone knows a compromise is necessary, but nobody can agree on one. That leaves us with 3 different ways this could all play out as we get closer and closer to that deadline. All right, scenario 1. This is the cleanest path forward. A last-minute deal gets done. It would probably include some concessions on police oversight, and a shutdown is avoided completely. Or, they could just kick the can down the road with another short-term extension just to buy a little more time. Then there's scenario 2, which is a bit more targeted. And honestly, a lot of people think this is the most likely outcome. It's what's called a partial shutdown. Basically, Congress funds most of the government, but leaves out the one agency that's right at the center of this whole debate, the Department of Homeland Security. So a partial shutdown is kind of like isolating just one government department and turning off its funding. But here's where it gets really interesting, a weird twist. Because of how some of the laws are written, certain essential law enforcement inside DHS, like ICE and Border Protection agents, might actually keep getting paid from different funds. It creates this bizarre situation where an agency is technically shut down, but key parts are still up and running. And you can bet that just adds more fuel to the political fire. Okay, and then there's the third path, the most disruptive one of all, a widespread shutdown. This is where the fight over DHS gets so toxic that it basically poisons the well for everything else. No one can agree on any of the other funding bills, and a huge chunk of the federal government just grinds to a halt. So, you've got this high-stakes negotiation going on. What kind of strategies might each side use to get what they want? Let's take a look inside the political playbook. Well, the main path to avoiding a shutdown involves some real concessions. We're talking about things like funding and requiring body cameras for federal agents, or bringing back staff and funding for internal DHS oversight offices, or even launching a totally independent investigation into the shootings. These are actual, tangible things you can offer to address the real complaints here. The other option, though, is way more confrontational. It's the blame game.
Instead of offering to meet in the middle, one side could just go on the attack, framing their opponents as weak on national security. The goal here isn't to find a compromise, it's to win the PR battle, if and when a shutdown actually happens.
But look, all this political maneuvering isn't just about winning the 24-hour news cycle. This kind of gridlock has real-world consequences that ripple out way beyond Washington, hitting the economy and the markets. So, what could this whole fight mean for your wallet? Well, if they manage to strike a compromise deal, you can probably expect the market to rally, just because all that uncertainty would be gone. A partial shutdown, that would likely cause some weakness, especially for stocks that are sensitive to any security disruptions. But a widespread shutdown, that could trigger a big risk-off move, hitting the entire market.
And yeah, certain sectors are definitely on high alert. Think about airlines and travel. They're super sensitive to any hint of trouble at the TSA. Defense and big IT contractors, they're worried about government contracts getting delayed. And you can absolutely expect the VIX, that's the market's fear gauge, to spike like crazy on the days when these big votes are happening. So as we're racing toward that January 30th deadline, here are 3 key signals you're going to want to watch for. First, will the Senate try to pass a bill that separates DHS funding from everything else? Second, keep an eye out for any compromise language, anything about body cams or oversight popping up in proposals. And third, and this is the big one, watch to see if Senate leaders schedule what's called a cloture vote. That's the 60-vote test that tells you if a filibuster is coming. Honestly, that will be the real moment of truth.
And all of this brings us to the final, really crucial question here. As both sides dig in their heels, they're weighing 2 things: the political price of compromise versus the very real, very tangible cost of a government shutdown. So which price will they ultimately decide is just too high to pay? I guess we're all going to find out this week.